The night I found out the truth about my husband, I was wearing someone else's uniform and carrying a tray of champagne glasses that didn't belong to me. I still remember the weight of it, not just the tray, but everything. 34 years of marriage, a house full of photographs, 2 children grown and gone, and me, 63 years old, standing in the service corridor of the Harrington Grand Hotel in my black slacks and borrowed white blouse, pretending to be someone I wasn't so I could find out who my husband really was. Let me back up. My husband's name is Gerald. Gerald Arthur Whitmore. He's 67, semi-retired, and for the past 34 years, he has been the kind of man other people describe as steady, reliable, a good provider, the kind of man who remembered anniversaries and fixed things around the house and never raised his voice. The kind of man I thought I knew completely. I started to notice something was different about 8 months before that evening. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things that didn't quite add up. Gerald had always been predictable in the way that comforts you when you've built a life around someone. He came home at the same time. He sat in the same chair. He ordered the same thing at restaurants we'd been to 100 times. But sometime around last spring, the edges of that predictability started to blur. He began leaving the room to take phone calls. Not every call, Sal, just some of them. He started going to the gym 3 mornings a week, which I would have thought nothing of except that Gerald had not voluntarily exercised a single day in the previous 15 years. He bought new cologne. I noticed it one evening when he leaned over to kiss me on the cheek before leaving for what he called a dinner with a client. And I thought, that's not the one I gave him for Christmas. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself this is what happens when you get older and your children have moved away and the house is quieter than it used to be. You start seeing shadows. You start imagining things that aren't there because your mind needs something to do. But then I found the receipt. It was in the pocket of his gray slacks, the ones I pulled from the hamper to wash. A dinner receipt from a restaurant called Maison Laurent, a French place downtown that Gerald and I had passed many times but never gone into because Gerald always said it looked pretentious. The receipt was for 2. A bottle of wine I recognized as expensive. Dessert. The kind of dinner you have when you want to impress someone. The date on the receipt was a Thursday. Gerald had told me that Thursday he was working late. Put the receipt back in his pocket. I washed the slacks. I said nothing. I don't know exactly why I stayed silent. Maybe I wasn't ready for what saying something might bring. Maybe I needed more than a receipt. Or maybe at 63 after 34 years, I simply could not afford to be wrong. So I waited. And I watched. And I started paying attention in ways I hadn't allowed myself to before. It was our daughter who first mentioned the foundation gala. She called me on a Sunday afternoon and asked if I was going with Gerald to the Harrington event, the annual fundraiser his company co-sponsored every December. I told her I hadn't heard anything about it. There was a pause on her end. Just a half second, the kind that means more than silence. And then she said she must have been mistaken, that she'd probably gotten the dates mixed up. She hadn't gotten the dates mixed up. I found the invitation on Gerald's desk 2 days later, tucked under a folder. It was addressed to him alone, which wasn't necessarily unusual. His name was on the company sponsorship. But when I looked at the RSVP confirmation he'd printed and left alongside it, there were 2 seats reserved, 2 dinners ordered, 2 name cards requested. One said Gerald Whitmore. The other said Diane. I stood at that desk for a long time. Long enough that the afternoon light shifted and the room grew a little darker around me. Then I took a photograph of the confirmation with my phone, put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and went to make dinner. That night, Gerald told me the gala was a work obligation, that it would be tedious, that I'd be bored stiff. He said it so naturally, so easily, that I almost believed him. I smiled and said I understood and asked if he wanted more potatoes. I had 11 days before the gala. The idea came to me in the middle of the night, the way the most important decisions often do. Not as a plan, but as a certainty. I was lying awake at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to Gerald breathe beside me, and I thought, I need to see it for myself. Not a receipt, not a name on a printed confirmation. I need to stand in the same room and understand what I'm actually dealing with before I decide what to do about it. I knew a woman named Patrice who managed the catering side of several downtown venues. We'd met years ago through a church committee and stayed loosely in touch. I called her the next morning while Gerald was at the gym and explained that I was looking to pick up some part-time work for the holidays. Something to keep me busy, I said. Something where I could be useful. Patrice was kind. She asked a few questions, none of which were difficult to answer, and told me that as it happened, she was short-staffed for a fundraiser at the Harrington Grand on the 14th. Could I serve? Pass trays, refill glasses, clear tables. Told her I'd done it before, which wasn't exactly a lie. I'd volunteered at enough events over the years that I knew how to carry a tray and move through a crowd without drawing attention. She said to arrive at 5. I told Gerald I was spending the evening with my sister, who lives 40 minutes away. He nodded without looking up from his phone. I noticed he didn't ask which night or what time I'd be back. I drove to the Harrington on my own, parked around the corner, and changed in the car. Black slacks, white blouse, flat shoes I'd bought specifically because they'd let me stand for hours. I pulled my hair back tight. I left off my usual earrings. Then I walked through the service entrance of the Harrington Grand Hotel and became, for one evening, invisible. Patrice handed me an apron and a name tag that said Margaret. She showed me the layout of the ballroom, explained which tables needed champagne and which needed sparkling water, and told me to stay near the east side of the room during the cocktail hour. I thanked her and took my tray and walked into the ballroom. It was a beautiful room. High ceilings with chandeliers, round tables with white linens, candles everywhere. The kind of room that makes ordinary people feel important, and important people feel celebrated. Guests were beginning to arrive in their evening clothes. The women in jewels and the men in dark suits, and the noise of it all. Glasses and laughter and the low murmur of conversation wrapped around me like a kind of insulation. I moved through the room slowly and carefully. I had been there perhaps 20 minutes when I saw Gerald. He was standing near the bar on the far side of the room, holding a glass of scotch, laughing at something the man beside him had said. He looked comfortable, at ease. He was wearing the navy suit I'd helped him pick out 3 years ago for our son's wedding, and his silver hair was neat, and he looked from across a crowded ballroom exactly like the man I had married. I turned away and kept moving. If he saw me, it would be over before it started. I worked my way to the other side of the room and positioned myself near a column where I had a view of the bar without being directly in Gerald's line of sight. That's when I saw her. She came through the main entrance about 10 minutes after I spotted Gerald. And I knew her immediately, not because I'd ever met her, but because something in the way Gerald's posture changed when she walked in told me everything. He didn't move toward her right away. He waited, the way people wait when they've agreed in advance to be careful. But his eyes went to her the moment she entered the room, and they stayed there. She was younger than me by perhaps 20 years. Dark hair, a deep green dress, composed in the way of someone who has learned to be comfortable in formal settings. She found Gerald without looking for him, which told me this wasn't the first time they'd been in this room together, or in any room like it. I watched them greet each other across the room with a handshake. A handshake. Then Gerald leaned in close to say something, and she smiled, and his hand touched the small of her back for just a moment before they both turned to join another group of guests. It was the smallest gesture. I've touched my husband's back 10,000 times without thinking about it. But something about the ease of it, the way neither of them even registered it, was the thing that finally broke through whatever I'd been protecting myself with for the past 8 months. I excused myself to the kitchen on the pretense of refilling my tray and stood over a sink for 2 minutes with the cold water running over my wrists. One of the younger servers asked if I was okay. I told her the room was warm. She nodded and went back to work. Then I dried my hands, picked up my tray, and went back out into the ballroom. The dinner service began, and I was kept busy enough that I could almost pretend I was just doing what I appeared to be doing: working, clearing plates, refilling glasses, thanking people who thanked me, and smiling at people who didn't notice me at all. Gerald's table was on the east side, near the stage, and I was assigned to the west, which I was grateful for. I could see the table from where I worked, but I didn't have to approach it. Gerald and Diane, that's the name I'd seen on the confirmation, and I found myself using it in my head, were seated together at a round table with 6 other people. She laughed easily. She touched his arm when she spoke. Gerald, my husband of 34 years, looked at her the way I hadn't seen him look at anything in a very long time. The dinner wound down and the speeches began. The company's CEO stood at the podium and spoke about the foundation's work, about the year behind them, and the year ahead. Names were mentioned, contributions acknowledged. I stood near the back of the room with my tray and listened and kept my face still. Then the man seated to Gerald's left, heavy-set, red-faced, the kind of man who mistakes volume for authority, pushed back his chair and stood up without being invited to. He raised his glass in Gerald's direction and said in a voice loud enough to carry past the nearest tables, "While we're celebrating, I think we should raise a glass to Gerald and Diane. Am I right? Come on, stand up, you two. Don't be shy." There was laughter, the scattered, easy laughter of people who already know something and are glad to finally say it out loud. Gerald went very still. Diane touched his hand briefly under the table. I saw it from 20 feet away, and then they both stood, and the laughter spread, and someone at the next table called out, "Finally, Gerald! How long have we all known?" And someone else said, "When's the wedding?" More laughter. I did not drop my tray. I want to say that clearly. I stood where I was, and I held my tray, and I watched my husband of 34 years stand beside another woman in a ballroom full of his colleagues, while they congratulated him on a future he had been building without me. He smiled, the smile of a man caught but only a little, and by people who consider it good news. I thought about our son's wedding 3 years ago in the Navy suit. I thought about the French restaurant receipt and the gray slacks. I thought about every night Gerald had come home smelling like different cologne and told me about a long day at the office. I thought about 34 years of photographs in a house that had been quieter than it should have been for longer than I'd admitted to myself. And I thought about the woman I had been for those 34 years, patient and loyal and quietly, steadily present. And I made a decision. I set my tray down on the nearest empty cart. I walked across the ballroom toward Gerald's table. He didn't see me until I was perhaps 6 feet away. And when he did, the color left his face so quickly and completely that the man next to him actually turned to see what Gerald was looking at. I stopped beside his chair. "Hello, Gerald," I said. My voice was calm. I was surprised by that. Afterward, how calm I was. He said my name, just my name, nothing else. "I see you got my seat," I said, and I looked at Diane, who had gone very still in her chair, and I said, "I'm his wife," in case he forgot to mention that. The table went quiet. The table next to ours went quiet. The man who had made the toast, with his too loud voice, was looking at the tablecloth. I turned back to Gerald. His mouth was opening and closing in the way of someone who has prepared for many things, but not for this particular one. "I found the invitation," I said quietly. "I found the confirmation with 2 name cards. I've known for months that something wasn't right, and I decided I needed to see it for myself before I made any decisions. So I did." Reached into my apron pocket and set the photograph I'd printed, the RSVP, confirmation, Gerald's name, and Diane's side by side, on the table in front of him. "I think," I said, "we have quite a bit to discuss, but not here, not tonight." Took off the borrowed apron, folded it neatly over the back of the empty chair, and I walked out of that ballroom the same way I had walked in, steadily, without rushing, with my head level. I drove home. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the house where we had lived for 22 years. And I let myself feel all the things I had been holding back through the service corps and the dinner and the speeches and that long walk across the room. Cried for a while, which is not weakness, it's just honesty. And then I stopped because there was work to be done. Gerald came home 2 hours later. I heard his car in the driveway, and then the front door, and then his footsteps in the hallway, slow in the way of a man who has spent 2 hours trying to figure out what to say and still hasn't managed it. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me. I looked back at him. How long? I asked. He told me. 2 years. I nodded. 2 years was longer than I had suspected and shorter than I had feared. Neither of those things made it better. I want you to stay with your brother tonight, I said. We'll talk tomorrow when I've had time to think. Margaret, Gerald. I said his name the same way he had said mine in that ballroom. Just the name, nothing else. But I meant something different by it. I meant, I'm still here. I'm still someone. And what comes next will happen on my terms, not yours. He left that night. I won't pretend that what followed was simple. 34 years of a life together does not unravel cleanly. And there were conversations that were painful in ways I had not anticipated, and moments when I doubted my own clarity. Our children needed to be told, which was its own separate grief. There were lawyers and paperwork and the long, grinding work of separating two lives that had been intertwined for more than 3 decades. But I will tell you this. The moment I walked across that ballroom, I stopped being afraid. Whatever I had been so frightened of all those months, the knowing, the confronting, the consequence, it turned out to be survivable, more than that. On the other side of the worst night of my marriage, I found something I hadn't expected to find. Myself. The version of me that had been patient and careful and measured and loyal, but also the version that could set a tray down and walk across a room and say what was true in a clear, quiet voice in front of everyone who needed to hear it. I'm 63 years old, spent 34 of those years building something I believed in with someone I trusted. That isn't nothing even now. I don't regret the years. I don't regret who I was in them. But I am not done, and this is not the end of my story. It's just the end of a chapter I should have closed sooner. My sister asked me afterward if I wished I had done it differently. If I wished I had confronted Gerald privately months earlier when I first suspected. Thought about it honestly before I answered her. No, I said. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know that what I felt was real. And I needed to be the one who decided what happened next. She asked if the other woman, Diane, had ever reached out. She hadn't. I don't expect she will. My sister asked one more thing. Are you okay? I considered the question the way I've learned to consider most things lately. Slowly, without rushing to an answer just because one is expected. I'm getting there, I said. But honestly, yes, I think I am. There's a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice or make dramatic gestures or perform for an audience. It just holds the tray steady and watches carefully and waits for the right moment, and then it acts. Not out of anger, but out of the quiet, absolute certainty that the truth matters and that you are worth it. I'm 63 years old, and I walked into that ballroom as a waitress and walked out as myself. That's the only part of the story that matters now. If you're going through something that feels impossible right now, if you're lying awake at 2 a.m, wondering whether what you feel is real, wondering whether you have the strength to face what you already know, I want you to hear this. You are not wrong for needing time. You are not wrong for being careful. And you are not too old or too tired or too far into something to choose yourself. Whatever comes next, that choice belongs to you.